People in power are always going to use whatever means necessary to try to remain in power. But what has, from time to time, changed the equation on them is when citizens create sort of an external threat, what I would consider constructive discomfort. And what I describe as first party movements have happened before. One of the instances I write about in the book was the birth of what is now the Republican Party. At that time, there were two major parties in America, the Whig Party and the Democratic Party. Both were pro-slavery parties. There was a growing abolitionist movement. People felt politically homeless. The system was rigged against them. They couldn't get their voices heard or their wishes respected. That sounds familiar. And some of them went into a little white schoolhouse in Ripon, Wisconsin. And they went into that room calling themselves Democrats. Some of them called themselves Whigs. Some called themselves abolitionists. Some were feeling so politically homeless, they called themselves free soilers. They refused to accept any of the party identities. They came out of that building united in calling themselves Republicans. A new identity had been fashioned. People had come together under a new name, a new brand. And interestingly, when the smoke all cleared, there were still only two major parties in America because we have a two-party system. But the Whig Party had been driven to extinction. And now the two major parties were the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. And of course, one party was the party of abolition. And it took a civil war to finally abolish slavery. And people were up against the same kinds of institutional or system obstacles that we're all up against now. People in power try to rig systems in their favor so that they remain in power. But people used their force to compel the parties to either adapt or perish. The Whig Party perished. Now, a little over a generation later, several decades later, and I write about this instance in the book, a 35-year-old attorney who was a Republican was offered a bribe to fix a legal case by a leader from his own party. And that attorney later wrote about how that was the moment that made the light bulb go on. And he decided, I can no longer in good conscience call myself a Republican because my party has grown corrupt. And that attorney started calling himself a progressive. A new identity was invented out of thin air. People hadn't been calling themselves progressives before. And that attorney, of course, was Robert M. La Follette, came to be known as Fighting Bob La Follette. And La Follette and his allies used that identity, attached it to that extraordinarily ambitious agenda that I described that culminated in those laws passed by the 1911 legislature, and they went to battle. When the smoke all cleared, there were not 3 or 4 parties, there were 2. It was still the Democratic and the Republican parties. But both parties were transformed. You had Teddy Roosevelt running as a progressive on the Republican ticket for president. And some years later, you had Woodrow Wilson running as a progressive on the Democratic ticket. Both parties felt that they had to embrace the progressive identity and embrace the progressive agenda, and they both participated in enacting that agenda because that's where the people were. We've got to demonstrate to those politicians who will do everything in their power to try to rig the system to keep themselves in power. We have to convince them that the people have left them and that the people are willing to coalesce around something new. And when that external threat becomes pronounced enough, they have no choice but to adapt or perish. They either have to embrace it and go where the people are, or they will perish. And every once in a while, that counterbalance, that citizen response to corrupted political power has indeed reshaped the political landscape. Now, to me, I have a hard time imagining what conditions need to exist that already don't exist today. When you look at historic levels of wealth and income inequality, when you look at concentrated political power, concentrated economic power, when you think about that downsizing of the American dream that people feel doomed to, think about the conditions that exist today. Those are conditions that are ripe for this kind of citizen insurgency. And it happens periodically. It's a purifying instinct that people have had in American democracy over the years. Every once in a while they just decide, no more. We are not going to allow this to continue. And they force change on politicians who do everything in their power to prevent that change. The Whigs fought it so hard, and they were so resistant that they ended up being driven to extinction. And I will tell you this, I don't have a good enough crystal ball to know exactly what's going to happen or when it will happen. But I think that there is a very real possibility that at some point, even in our lifetimes, one or both of the major parties will cease to exist in their current form. I truly believe that we are, again, at a set of conditions so eerily reminiscent to those that produced those previous purifying moments that there is a transformation coming. But it's up to us to make it come faster. It's up to us to bring it about, just as it was up to past generations, citizens of past generations who are feeling just as powerless and just as unheard and unrepresented as we are. They took it as their mission to make that system change, and they succeeded. And I don't see why, if they could succeed, I don't see why we can't. Again, I refuse to believe that there's something fundamentally wrong with us that makes us incapable of making change.